So now we want to turn our attention to many of the broader ripple effects that are happening here as it concerns the legal case in front of the International Court of Justice in terms of Israel committing genocide, and also some of the ongoing implications of the Ukraine war for Europe and the United States, and possibly some points of hope on both of these points as well. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Sevim Dağdelen, who is a Minister of Parliament in the Bundestag in Germany and the foreign policy spokesperson for the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht Party. Sevim, thank you so much for being back with us.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here, although Rania is not there.
I know. It's a disappointment to us all. Hopefully our listeners won't hold it against me. Great to have you as always. So, I wanted to start here talking a little bit about the ICJ and maybe just to give some context here. I think people have probably seen maybe some headlines that Germany has intervened, the government of Germany has intervened on Israel's behalf as it concerns the charge of genocide. And I guess that's kind of my first question is why would Germany take this step to step into this case and defend Israel against the charge of genocide brought by South Africa and now many other nations?
Well, Eugene, the German government's intervention on Israel's side before the ICJ in South Africa's genocide case is part of its unconditional support for Israel's war in Gaza. Germany and other leading NATO states support Israel because of their geopolitical interest in not losing Israel as an ally in the region, especially with regard to the conflict against Iran. And in Germany, there is also the fact that the German government places its claimed raison d'etat, Staatsräson, what they say, of unconditionally defending Israel's right to exist above international law. And regardless of all violations of international humanitarian law by the Israeli government, the German government therefore continues to support Israel politically, financially, and militarily. And by intervening before the ICJ, it is clearly seeking to prevent Israel's war crimes and human rights violations from being prosecuted under international law. And after all, by supporting Israel, the German government shares responsibility for these crimes. This is also the reason why Germany itself has been now charged by Nicaragua before the ICJ, and the German government is accused of abetting genocide and violations of international humanitarian law with its massive arms deliveries to Israel and its ceasing to the fund to the United Nations Palestinian Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Nicaragua intervention against Germany, because I believe you were there as a parliamentary observer as some of that played out. And I'm curious some of your reflections on that. I mean, how Germany was responding to Nicaragua's charge that they are indeed aiding and abetting genocide in Gaza, and just anything else you think was relevant from being there in that hearing.
Well, the German defense essentially put forward two arguments which, however, were not very convincing to me, at least. So firstly, it tried to play down the importance of German arms aid to Israel. However, Germany is Israel's second largest arms supplier after the United States. According to the data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, German weapons have accounted for 30% of Israel's arms imports over the last 5 years. Last year, 2023, Germany's share was as high as 47%, closely behind the US with 53%. So licenses for new arms exports in 2023, most of them after 7th October, have also increased 10 times compared to the previous year. And these included, according to questionnaires to the government by me and my group, Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht in the German Bundestag, and this was the basis actually of the indictment of Nicaragua, all the informations they got from my parliamentary work in the German Bundestag. These included 3,000 anti-tank weapons that or munition can be used directly in the war against the Palestinian civilian population. So this was the first argument. The second argument, was the German government has put forward very absurd, formalistic argument that the ICJ has not yet classified the Israeli military operation as a genocide, and that Germany cannot therefore be found guilty of aiding and abetting a genocide. In doing so, however, the German government is ignoring the central obligation under international law that arises from the Genocide Convention, namely to prevent a genocide. Yeah, and this is all the more important as the ICJ, in the case of South Africa versus Israel, considered on the 26th of January that there is a plausible risk of genocide and issued provisional measures to protect the civilian population in Gaza. So regardless of how the ICJ decides, at the end of the day, the German government and the US government must urgently stop supplying arms to Israel, as the UN Human Rights Council has called for, and as a NATO partner, Canada already did. They stopped the arms to Israel. And this is all the more important as Israel is ignoring the UN Security Council's call for ceasefire. And that's why we urgently need to prevent a further bloodshed through an invasion in Rafah and an escalation in the conflict with Iran. Germany and the United States of America must finally impose an arms embargo on Israel and thus exert pressure for an immediate ceasefire and an end to Israeli war crimes.
I mean, maybe I shouldn't be surprised at this, but it really does seem, and I'm hoping you can comment on this, like there's something of a double standard at play here as way Germany, the United States, the way they're approaching this. I mean, Russia, it was like 3 weeks into the invasion of Ukraine, and they said that's a genocide. When we talk about other countries around the world, Myanmar, Sudan, there's never any sort of like reticence, even though we're not seeing, and this is not to downplay anything happening in any of these places, but there's not the same level of just everyday documentation. But in this case, it's like everyone's at great pains to say that there is no genocide. So I was wondering if you could just speak to that aspect and what you think is behind that.
Well, unfortunately, that's true. In my view, the West's handling of the war in Gaza is a new peak of Western double standards. There is no doubt that Israel is waging a brutal war, committing numerous war crimes that have killed more than 33,000 people, including more than 13,000 children. And the fact that the West continues to support Israel despite the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and the violations of international humanitarian law by this right-wing government in Israel shows its complete hypocrisy and double standards when it comes to the protection of human rights and respect for international law claimed by the West itself. And I think this is really an impressive illustration of its instrumental approach to international law, which is apparently only supposed to apply when it suits the West's own geopolitical interests. These double standards and the conditional support of Israel have created the framework for the partly far-right Israeli government not to hesitate to set off a dangerous spiral of escalation with the attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, in Syria. So the US, the United Kingdom, and France have blocked the condemnation of the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy by the UN Security Council, and the German government has also not condemned Israel's attack, in contrast to the Iranian counterattack. And this is an example of how the West's double standards promote the erosion of international law and diplomacy and contribute to the escalation of conflicts.
Switching gears here a little bit, although these are all interconnected issues for sure, this year is the 75th anniversary of NATO. And as you know very well, the big conversation in the U.S. this week is whether or not the U.S. was going to send $60 billion to Ukraine to continue the war. But one of the subtexts there is this idea of Ukraine joining NATO, which, of course, they're saying that this is definitely going to happen. The U.S. is saying they're behind it. And, of course, we're told here in the United States, well, this is the only way to keep our friends in Germany and France and Poland safe, is we have to bring Ukraine into NATO and give all of this money. So since you actually are in Germany and in the Parliament of Germany, I would be very curious your thoughts about what are the implications of bringing Ukraine into NATO, and is it true that we need NATO to keep our friends in Europe safe?
Well, I think Ukraine's entry into NATO would be a direct path to the Third World War. Due to the obligation to provide assistance under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So I therefore do not believe that the NATO states are currently interested in Ukraine joining NATO directly. Rather, the problem lies in the fact that NATO is sticking unconditionally to the goal of Ukraine joining NATO in the future. And this prevents any diplomatic solution to the ongoing war in Ukraine. And that's that's the biggest problem we are facing now. We have to stop this war in Ukraine because this war has the danger of Third World War. That's really a big risk. So that's why I think this is the major challenge we are facing at the moment. And 75th birthday, from my perspective, 75 years too much for the NATO.
No, and I know you also have a new book, by the way, coming out about NATO, which we're hoping to get in English very soon so we can promote it as much as possible. And I guess that's another sort of question I'm curious your thoughts about is the role that NATO really plays in sort of the U.S.-European relationship. I mean, the way it's presented is, this is a collaborative partnership in defense, but it almost seems to me, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, that it's as much a mechanism to assure European countries never do anything against the U.S. agenda as it concerns Europe. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, NATO is essentially an instrument of the United States, the extended arm of its geopolitics. The United States is the undisputed leading power of this military pact. As such, it exercises control over the foreign and security policy of all the other NATO member states. And for the other NATO states, membership of NATO always means a loss of their own democratic sovereignty. And this is because the US always imposes its interests and its financial, its economic, and of course, militarily and geopolitical interests hegemonically. And the other NATO states, they became vassal states that have to submit to the US. The proxy war against Russia demonstrates this relationship of subordination very clearly from my perspective. And there is an really urgent need for an independent, sovereign Europe that interests of its own people in peace and prosperity above the interest of US geopolitics. We must think about alternatives to NATO in the form of a system of mutual security in Europe, and we have to nail the legends of the NATO propaganda that NATO would be a defense alliance or would be an alliance of human rights, democracies, and of values. This is just propaganda by the NATO, and this is actually the reason why I wrote the book.
Well, I think it's very important. I'm glad you wrote the book. I mean, this is certainly, at least in the U.S. perspective, something that people are very, very, very confused about in terms of the role of NATO, and an important one. But, I feel like we touched on Gaza, we've touched on the genocide, we've touched on the proxy war. Obviously we're in a bleak situation worldwide, and, the declining of living standards of the working class everywhere. But nonetheless, you were someone who is very involved in many different efforts for peace, for social justice. Obviously, you're engaging in politics. So I just wonder, do you see any points for hope in the world that is, so mired in war and so mired in injustice?
Always, Eugene, always. That's why I'm doing politics, because I agree with the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. What we need is pessimism of the mind, the intellect, and an optimism of the will. So there is no doubt that we are living in extremely, extremely dangerous times with NATO's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia and its expansion into Asia to confront China. NATO is driving the world closer to the edge of a third world war than ever before. And our task as a left anti-war movement is to inform, to enlighten the people about the dangers of NATO expansion and to stand up for peace and peaceful alternatives to NATO's policy of war, confrontation, and armament. And it will be crucial that the decline of the United States as the only world hegemon and the related transition to the multipolar age takes place without a major war. So only then we will be able to build a hopeful development, such as the rise of the BRIC states to achieve a more peaceful and just world order. So let me repeat, what we need is pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will.
Very well taken point. And as always, we really appreciate having you on, and we really appreciate or are really looking forward to being able to hold up the English language copy of your book very soon about NATO. And certainly we'll be having you back to get folks more in tune with that. Sevim Dağdelen, member of the Bundestag for the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht Party. Thank you so much, as always, for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me, Eugene. Take care. Bye-bye.